You'll be noticing that in this episode, I will be a lot more gratuitously profane than usual. Generally, I like to use profanity for emphasis only, to provide some balance to the mundane or perhaps to underline or accentuate a point, but then I received feedback from a particularly fastidious viewer who commented that in my first video, it was nearly 11 minutes until the first fuck. Well, I am all about applying fucking feedback, so why the fuck waste a perfectly good fucking opportunity?
Shit. Yes, shit.
It's not my fucking fault, man. The fucking weapon is fucking fucked up.
Fucking fuck. Fucking bugger. Buggity, fuck.
You have to use so many cuss words. The fuck you talking about?
Willy, shit, and fuck, and tits.
Let's move on, shall we? Okay. Note that there may be spoilers in this episode. I apologize in advance if I end up ruining your fun. So let's talk about samurai films, arguably the most influential of all cinematic genres. They have endured for decades, with a heritage that extends back far longer. It is an understatement to say that samurai films are popular, along with the Chinese cinema that really came into its own during the 1970s era with Sunday matinee kung fu films, referred to in decidedly non-PC terms as chopsakis. Samurai films stand as one of the most enduringly popular types of Asian cinema. These films are collectively referred to as chambara, which translates as sword film, which itself is a subgenre of the jidaigeki film, the Japanese word for period piece, essentially the Japanese equivalents of films such as Stanley Kubrick's incredible Barry Lyndon or the Merchant Ivory productions that were quite popular back in the 1980s and 1990s, such as Remains of the Day. It's important to note that the term jidaigeki does not inherently imply a film about samurai, and indeed many of these Japanese period films are focused on other inhabitants of the given period depicted. However, most chambara are also jidaigeki. When we discuss the samurai narrative, a critical question for that discussion is, where did it all come from? And to answer that question, we can take a look at the cultural history of Japan, which spans nearly 2,000 years. I specify cultural history because, while the Japanese islands were inhabited from prehistory, the roots of what we now consider Japanese evolved from Chinese and Korean influences mingling with the native population. Korean Buddhism fused and coexisted with the native Shinto religion, and it was during this early time that the first cultural edicts were written to govern behaviors within the state. That concept of behavioral codification, not unlike the Ten Commandments or portions of the Code of Hammurabi, is an important one, as we shall see. This population eventually coalesced in about 700 AD. This starting point, if you will, was referred to as the Nara period, where Japanese culture became centered around the imperial court. It was during this period that the now widely famous forms of Japanese poetry first appeared. This was followed by the Heian period from about 800 to 1185 AD, which saw increased political turmoil, with warring factions vying for control and largely invalidating any central ruling body. Japanese writing came into its own during this era, leaving Chinese and Korean influence behind to create a unique voice. Next came the very important Kamakura period from 1185 to 1333, which saw the victorious warlord consolidate power into a warrior class. The leaders of this warrior class were known as shogun, a title which, while originally bestowed during the Heian period, came to new prominence here. The shogunate acted as the military wing of the central imperial government, which had essentially been relegated to figurehead status. Succession was within families, and thus the name of the various shogunates, and by extension the lineage involved, were of great importance. This period marked the beginning of feudal Japan, and as with any feudal system, these shogunates required the servitude of lords, in Japan's case referred to as daimyo, who were then rewarded with their own minor fiefdoms and vassals to do with as they pleased as long as it was in service to their shogun. This was also where the first samurai appeared, as retainers of the daimyo, and thus indirectly to the shogun. Think of them as bodyguards for their lords. They were the fighters who were provided with the most advanced weaponry and the training to use those weapons with deadly effect. One definitely didn't want to end up on the bottom rung of society in these types of caste systems. Just ask the peasantry from medieval Europe how that worked out for them.
Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!
From a spiritual perspective, Buddhist philosophy expanded greatly during this period. Literature also continued its evolution within the country. The Muromachi period from 1333 to 1568 saw continuous battles for shogun rule, with factions vying for power, land, and status. It was during the Muromachi period that the first Europeans, Portuguese, landed on Japan and would go on to establish trade routes that would also introduce the musket to the battlefield. During the Azuchi Momoyama period that followed, peasants were summarily disarmed, social classes became effectively irrevocable, and the newly arrived Christian religion was heavily persecuted. The early roots of Japanese expansionism were quickly quashed when they tried invading Korea with less than ideal results. The bloodshed required for reunification finally ended with the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate and the beginning of the Edo period, which would see 268 years of successive Tokugawa rule from 1600 to 1868. You may recognize the name Edo as the name of the city which became Tokyo, and where the seat of power lay during this period. Japan saw a huge rise in its population during this time, as well as the implementation of a severe isolationist policy that would characterize Japanese culture for centuries. New cultural icons such as the geisha were introduced, because you have to sex up your samurai after all, and to the samurai came also the emergence of the Bushido, or samurai code. This code is the key element of the overarching samurai narrative we're discussing, and we'll take a closer look shortly. Following the Edo period, Japan entered what is commonly and oversimplistically called the modern era, with the Meiji period in 1868 that saw the rise of Japanese imperialism, which would of course culminate during World War II, and most importantly for our discussion, it represented the downfall of the shogunate and the decline and disappearance of the samurai class. The pivot point that was World War II was also critical in shaping the celluloid stories of the samurai. This overall timeline, which I readily admit is about as abridged as you can get, helps us to understand the genesis of the samurai narrative and also its evolution. All things samurai are rooted in and nurtured by these successive historical periods of change and turmoil. To understand the history of Japan is to understand the samurai on a whole different level, and I strongly urge all of you to do some of your own research to provide the additional depth that is simply too voluminous to properly cover here. Of note is that the vast majority of samurai films are set during the Edo period of Japanese culture, however, not exclusively so, as some samurai narratives take place in earlier eras and some have even made their way into depictions from the modern world. We'll discuss some of those later. All samurai films are rooted in a specific mythos, which celebrates a specific ethos, leading to a specific evocation of raw emotion, all shaped by the unique history of Japan. The tropes and themes that we see time and again in the samurai film are based on a tradition of honor and respect, which consistently permeates through the characters in these films and factor into the decisions they make, whether leading to victory or tragedy as a result. One thing that I want to address is the brilliant, amazing, creative, and impactful elephant in the room, because it is impossible to discuss samurai films without discussing Akira Kurosawa. Kurosawa is synonymous with samurai films, an auteur on the subject who is inexorably connected to his subject matter. He is what Alfred Hitchcock is to the suspense film, what John Ford is to the American Western, what Sergio Leone is to the spaghetti Western, what Roger Corman is to low-budget sci-fi, what Russ Meyer is to, whatever it is that Russ Meyer does. The point is that with every type of film there are the auteurs, those filmmakers who insist on total or near-total control of their product and who serve as the force that defines the very structure of a genre. Often with auteurs like Kurosawa, they tend to cast a very long shadow on the other capable and excellent filmmakers that work within the subject matter, and while we will give Kurosawa his due, this episode is intended to look beyond his works, to pay respect to the rich tapestry of the samurai narrative and all of the iterations it has inspired. And in giving him his due, let us acknowledge that it was Akira Kurosawa that set into motion the samurai visual and narrative sensibilities, as well as promoting the mythology that helped to shape not only his contemporaries, but future generations of filmmakers as well. His most memorable works include films that you may have heard of: Yojimbo, Rashomon, The Hidden Fortress, and of course Seven Samurai. Kurosawa was himself descended from samurai tradition, which may be a key reason why his films' depictions of the samurai are so compelling. Poetically, it's an absolutely perfect pipeline of inspiration when you think about it. Certainly, Kurosawa was a man who loved his work, and his films served to speak to elements of the human spirit forever embodied in the narratives he created. An artist on canvas as well as film, Kurosawa would often use his own paintings as his storyboards, a methodical approach that certified his investment in the finished work. Any person who is willing to go to such painstaking lengths to realize their vision will always have my respect. This translation of painted concept to filmed concept yielded spectacular, visceral, visual results. The tapestries that Kurosawa wove influenced his contemporaries and others that followed, highlighting one of the many distinguishing features of samurai films, the thoughtful, symbolic tableaus that make the genre so distinctive. A tableau is essentially the visual concept one sees in a painting. The idea of film tableau is that the director goes to great lengths to arrange people and things within the frame in a very deliberate manner. This doesn't mean that every frame in a movie is a tableau, but directors like Kurosawa can get pretty damn close. I've often said take any Akira Kurosawa film, advance randomly through, and freeze on any frame. Then take a screenshot and mount it on your wall because just about any shot in a Kurosawa film is a work of art. Here's one from 1945's The Men Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail. Here's one from 1985's Ran. It's fucking spectacular. Sergio Leone films have that same quality, and it's no wonder since Leone borrowed much inspiration from Kurosawa. Look at this shot from 1968's Once Upon a Time in the West. Later filmmakers had similar sensibilities, whether talking about Terrence Malick in films like The Gorgeous Days of Heaven from 1978, or later when we saw this artistry used by the likes of Wes Anderson in his films such as The Darjeeling Limited from 2007. It was not hyperbole when I mentioned in the opening that there has perhaps been no more influential genre in the history of the cinema than the samurai film. The number of movies and stories that owe varying levels of inspiration, homage, and parody to samurai films is utterly astounding. If we take a look at just a few of the more famous examples, you might be quite surprised. Chances are you've seen the most famous samurai film of all, Seven Samurai. Even if you've never seen it, you probably still have. It was the direct inspiration for the 1960 masterpiece The Magnificent Seven from director John Sturges, one of the best-known adaptations of the samurai narrative, and you probably didn't even realize it. The story of 7 wanderers coming together to help a defenseless village defeat a feared enemy. Sound familiar? It should. It was remade in 2016 by Antoine Fuqua. There was even a science fiction version produced by the great Roger Corman called Battle Beyond the Stars, again an exact thematic retelling of 7 samurai set in outer space. This is a really fun, low-budget flick, one of the best examples of a B-movie, though this type of B-movie doesn't have an evil Ray Liotta in it, and that's a shame. But it does have Robert Vaughn, who was also in The Magnificent Seven, and here is essentially playing the same character. Here, too, is the legendary Sybil Danning, who was a renowned staple of 1980s soft-core skin flicks, and John Saxon, a wonderfully versatile character actor who you may remember from one of the most famous kung fu films of all time, Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon, a movie that shares many themes with samurai films. These remakes don't stop there. Even Three Amigos is essentially the same story. If you want to see some true cheese, try Bruno Mattei's The Seven Magnificent Gladiators from 1983, which stars an awesomely dubbed Lou Ferrigno.
Hold it!
You give up?
On one condition.
What condition?
That you join us. There's a village of women, children, and old people who are going to be destroyed unless something is done. We decided to help them. And we need you.
If there are children and old people in danger, you can count on me.
And he stars alongside Sybil Danning once again. I swear some actors must have had a contest going to see who could star in the most number of remakes of the same story. The Seven Magnificent Gladiators was for Lou Ferrigno what 1969's Hercules in New York was for Arnold Schwarzenegger.
What is the name of that imitator? Who gave him permission to pretend to be Hercules?
Although it should be noted that Ferrigno also filmed his own version of Hercules back-to-back with the Seven Magnificent Gladiators. Seven Samurai is definitely a ripe garden for inspiration and adaptation, and is not only recognized as one of the greatest of the samurai films, but also one of the greatest films of all time. It's also noteworthy as a vehicle for the terrific Toshiro Mifune, one of Japan's greatest actors and definitely a defining face of the samurai genre. This cannot be understated. Toshiro Mifune is linked to Akira Kurosawa the same way as Robert De Niro and Martin Scorsese, Chow Yun-fat and John Woo, Johnny Depp and Tim Burton. Mifune was, in this sense, ubiquitous. Just like it seems you can't have a real mob movie without De Niro, you can't have a real samurai movie without Mifune. He worked with Kurosawa over the course of 16 films, beginning with Drunken Angel in 1948, which notably was not a samurai film, and ending with Redbeard in 1965, which was tangentially a samurai film. In between, this collaboration cemented the genre. It's important to note that Drunken Angel was a Japanese gangster film, dealing with the Yakuza, Japan's answer to the Mafia.
Perhaps you've heard of the Yakuza, the poison fists of the Pacific Rim? The Japanese Mafia?
They'll kill you 5 times before you hit the ground.
Important to note as well that while Kurosawa made films in both the Yakuza and samurai genre, he was the originator of neither. The earliest Yakuza films date back to the 1920s, and while Kurosawa's first samurai film was The Men Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail, several other samurai films preceded it. The earliest of these was most likely 1925's silent film Orochi, directed by Buntaro Futagawa, a film which I have to say is really beautifully staged and shot for that era, and perhaps most notably The 47 Ronin, directed by Kenji Mizoguchi, which influenced many filmmakers and saw remakes and adaptations of its own. Kurosawa acknowledged Mizoguchi as an influence on his own work. And this is a key point that I wanted to make during this episode, specifically that while Akira Kurosawa is the best-known director of samurai films to Western audiences, his predecessors and contemporaries also worked to define and contribute to this awesome genre. Masahiro Makino gave us Ronengai, also known as the Samurai Town series, in 1928. From 1954 to 1956, Hiroshi Inagaki released his samurai trilogy centered on the wandering philosopher Miyamoto Musashi. Daisuke Ito gave us Scar Yasaburo in 1960, a blend of samurai and yakuza genres. Masaki Kobayashi directed the excellent Harakiri in 1962, followed by 1967's Samurai Rebellion. Kihachi Okamoto created Samurai Assassin in 1965, and Okamoto was renowned for his extensive use of brutal violence in his films. In many ways, his were a precursor to John Woo's Hong Kong crime films of the 1980s. I also want to reserve a special call-out for the brilliant filmmaker Yasujiro Ozu. Ozu was a director of dramas, not samurai films. However, his visual filmmaking techniques and brooding analytical approach to his subject matter definitely inspired Japanese filmmakers from the early 1930s to the 1960s. If you want to see his best film, I would encourage you to watch 1953's Tokyo Story. I find that it has so much in common with Robert Redford's Ordinary People from 1980, which is, by the way, the film that somehow beat Raging Bull for Best Picture at the Oscars that year. What is most important to note about these many contributors and contemporaries of Japanese cinema and samurai films specifically is that they inspired each other with their framing, fight choreography, and storytelling, and that they often were inspired by the works of foreign filmmakers as well. Kihachi Okamoto acknowledged on many occasions his love for the American Western in the tradition of John Ford's Stagecoach from 1939, and talked about how he would often inject those Western sensibilities into his films. What that yields ultimately is a robust interweaving of cross-cultural cinematic art. That influence and extensive cross-pollination went far beyond Seven Samurai. Kurosawa's 1961 film Yojimbo was remade by Sergio Leone as 1963's A Fistful of Dollars with Clint Eastwood, and this is most interesting because when we think of the man with no name, a trope used in spaghetti westerns and numerous other films since, we think of Clint Eastwood. But Sergio Leone and Clint Eastwood were not the originators of this idea. The name of the main character in Yojimbo is Sanjuro, a Japanese name with multiple translations and meanings, and therefore no meaning at all. Hence, the concept of the man with no name that was adopted by Leone to heighten the air of mystery around Clint Eastwood's character. We saw that trend continue in 1966's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where he was referred to only as Blondie, as well as 1985's Pale Rider, where the main character was simply referred to as Preacher, and culminating in 1992's Unforgiven, where the William Money character admits to having gone by many names in his life, thus letting us identify him as the aged version of the man with no name. Just think for a moment how much mileage was carved out of that one deliberate character sketch by Kurosawa. Pretty astounding. Yojimbo, by the way, has been remade numerous times, including loosely by the 1966 film Django with Franco Nero, which would later inspire the character in name only from Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained in 2012. By the way, Kurosawa successfully sued Leone for copyright violations. I almost hate to bring this one up, but Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress from 1958 is cited as a direct inspiration for Star Wars. Now, I have to say I'm a bit lukewarm to this idea. I place no blame on George Lucas for this story, as he said he loved this film and he lifted certain elements from it to use in Star Wars. Certainly, the oft-repeated anecdote that Darth Vader's appearance was inspired by samurai armor is compelling when you do a side-by-side comparison. What I find, however, is that many Star Wars fans treat The Hidden Fortress as if all Lucas did was change the names and he was good to go. Not at all. The film definitely has a C-3PO and an R2-D2. It has a princess. It has a not Han Solo, not Luke Skywalker, not Obi-Wan Kenobi character. It has a sort of Darth Vader character. And the not Han Solo, not Luke Skywalker, not Obi-Wan Kenobi character has a sword fight with the sort of Darth Vader character. But apart from those very tenuous similarities, there isn't much more that translates. I've always found The Hidden Fortress kind of boring. And while we're talking Star Wars, something that's always bothered me. For any of you who buy the bullshit that George Lucas had always intended to make prequels and sequels from the get-go, ask yourself why, in Episode 4, Obi-Wan addresses Vader by saying,
"Only a master of evil, Darth."
Now, if Darth is Vader's first name, fine. But if the Sith used Darth as a title, as in Darth Sidious, Darth Maul, Darth Tyrannus, then it makes no sense at all. If Darth is a title, he should have referred to him as Vader. Anyway, Han shot first. What is it about the samurai genre that has been so inspiring to other filmmakers across genre lines? To answer that question, let's look at the content of the samurai narrative in more detail. The samurai films are based on the historical events and the resultant literature and oral traditions of the various eras that we have discussed, and the evolution of social sensibilities that define Japanese culture for centuries. Earlier on, too, I spoke of the importance of a codification of behaviors, and indeed, from the later Edo period came the Bushido Code. This code is the element that forms the very backbone of all samurai narratives. Bushido was how the samurai lived their lives, and it was comprised of 8 tenets that meant everything to the samurai: justice, courage, mercy, politeness, integrity, loyalty, self-control, and honor. Honor is the single most recognizable character trait of the samurai. Their sense of self-worth was measured by their observance of the highest level of personal moral conduct, both in peace and in battle, befitting their social status and professional responsibilities. This is what it meant to be a samurai. This idea of living by a code translates across cultures and has been one of the most enduring inspirational elements. We see it in films such as 1986's Highlander, where warriors fight with swords and abide by a strict code with the knowledge that there can be only one. We see it in the John Wick movies, where the ultraviolent chaos is governed by a code observed by all warriors, and the penalty for disobedience is death. And you'll see it in just about any film that gives you a hero, and sometimes even a villain, that will put down a weapon in order to provide a fair fight. These same concepts of the warrior class, guided by a strong code and in protection of a leader or their own society, are a familiar aspect in Star Wars with the Jedi, and in a more negative sense, the Emperor's Imperial Guard. Perhaps we see the most fully formed translation in the Star Trek franchise. It is abundantly clear that the Klingons are essentially a mirror of the samurai. There is a constant reminder of the warrior culture that defines the Klingon Empire. We see it in their clothes, both military and ceremonial. We see it in their weapons, such as the batleth. We see it in their adherence to their warrior code.
And then some. No offense, sir.
None taken. I never killed anyone at the supper table, Mr. LaForge.
There is a seemingly unending call-out to honor and family, and to family names in particular.
I am Worth, son of Moog.
I served a proud family, a strong house.
Our future is honor. Our present is serving this ship.
But if you can stand here and murder this pathetic little man, then you have no honor.
There are even references to literature and art such as Klingon opera, hearkening to the idea of Japanese forms such as kabuki theater. And that appreciation of literature was showcased in 1991's Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, where David Warner's Chancellor Gorkin proclaimed,
"You have not experienced Shakespeare until you have read him in the original Klingon."
And where the awesomely Canadian Christopher Plummer, in playing the equally awesome General Chang, quotes Shakespeare throughout the film.
Cry havoc! And let's slip the dogs of war!
This tie back to Shakespeare is important, as we will see in a moment. And as for Chang, well, this guy has an eye patch nailed to his fucking face. Now that's what I call epic. And from this anchor in the concept of honor, we come to the heart of why samurai films endure: the archetypal nature of their heroes, villains, and narratives. Archetypes are those familiar characters with whom we can relate and who speak to us on a deeper level by touching something within us in a way that is intriguing. I would argue that archetypal sensibilities go beyond just character types and also extend to all of those familiar constructs and narratives, behaviors, visuals, and cinematic beats that we come to expect when watching certain films. So in the samurai film, we can see a rich parade of these archetypes, and we can also see how they have come to inspire others outside the genre. We have the world of the Superman, where everyone is mundane except for a select few that have seemingly superhuman powers and cannot be beaten. This is the very basis of the world of the spaghetti westerns, and can also be seen in such films as John Woo's western-inspired Hard Target from 1993, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme. Another aspect is the bittersweet nature of the samurai stories, because they overwhelmingly dwell on the end of an era, in this case the decline of the samurai in Japanese hierarchical society during the end of the Edo period. We see similar explorations in films like Sam Peckinpah's 1969 The Wild Bunch, as well as his underrated The Ballad of Cable Hogue in 1970. These are worlds where the warriors have become an anachronism in the face of advancing technologies and a changing society. And in much the same way as the machine gun is used as a signal of that new technology in The Wild Bunch, the machine gun is also used for similar thematic effect in Edward Zwick's truly excellent The Last Samurai from 2003, which is a much more realistic and accurate take on the same end-of-an-era sentiment. Another archetype is the mentor who lives just long enough to pass on their wisdom to a new student, and we see that clearly in the Star Wars films with Obi-Wan Kenobi or with Yoda. We see the world-weary fighter who just wants to retire in peace, however fate always seems to have other plans. We see this in films like 2014's John Wick or in the Rambo film series. We have the concept of the duel of honor between warriors, which is used to nearly literal effect in Walter Hill's 1979 cult classic, The Warriors. We have heavily armed protagonists, particularly the character of Ogami Ito in Lone Wolf and Cub, with every manner of lethal weapon embedded in the ever-present baby cart. Samurai equipment typically consisted of dual swords. Used together, these could be a deadly combination. This idea of wielding dual weapons was no doubt an influence on such filmmakers as John Woo, as seen in 1989's The Killer with his ballet of dual-handed death, which has become his signature, as well as later works such as 2002's Equilibrium by Kurt Wimmer, also a very clear inheritor of samurai ideals and mores. We have battle scenes depicted with highly choreographed violence, often against insurmountable odds, and which is a trope that is exciting to audiences everywhere, whether in Lord of the Rings or in Game of Thrones, two examples with stylistic visual language familiar in the samurai genre. There is intense violence. It's actually quite shocking to see the level of gore on display as early as Kurosawa's 1962 film Sanjuro, with a blood spurt that was clearly a massive influence on Quentin Tarantino when he made Kill Bill. Many tend to think of samurai films as stoic affairs, but they're actually loaded with comedy. Many are under the misconception that they are filled with a bunch of angry guys in armor yelling and fighting. While there is certainly a somber, tragic aspect of the samurai film canon, humor, often understated, is an integral part of the mythology. It subverts our expectations when we think about the idea of a samurai who laughs. We see that in other films where the perceived humorless character reveals an element of levity, however bleak. We also saw that in Alan Moore's 1988 graphic novel The Killing Joke, where Batman, who himself is very much a mirror of the samurai concept through his connection with the League of Shadows and Ra's al Ghul, cannot stifle a laugh when the Joker recounts a funny bon mot at the end of this tragic story. We have intrigue, where in many cases the otherwise straightforward story path of the hero is confounded by being double-crossed, or perhaps we hear about a nobleman murdering his brother for power, which then sets the plot in motion. Think about any action film you've seen where the person you thought was helping the protagonist betrays them for personal gain, such as in 1993's Carlito's Way. We see the concept of the skilled warrior who has been tasked with protecting a child, which reaches its zenith in the Lone Wolf and Cub film series. We've seen the concept widely used in films such as 1994's Léon, also known as The Professional to just about everyone.
What do you mean everyone?
We saw it in 1987's Man on Fire, 1988's Willow, and most recently in 2019's The Mandalorian series. Lone Wolf and Cub, by the way, is an extremely violent 6-film series from the 1970s that you really must watch and which was adapted from the manga of the same name. Manga is essentially a Japanese picture book format of storytelling, akin to the Occidental comic book form, or perhaps more accurately the graphic novel, and serves as a critical tributary to the samurai narrative. It is absolutely impossible to do justice to the intricacies of manga in this video, so suffice it to say that manga originated during the Edo period and allowed a massive explosion of artistic creativity fused with writing that helped to shape the exciting, intriguing, and often shockingly erotic and taboo narratives that would be interpreted and intermingled as part of the samurai film genre. This was definitely not a form that was exclusively for kids. If any of you are familiar with the woodcut The Dream of the Fisherman's Wife, it is an example of Japanese erotic art referred to as shunga. And shunga was a large part of many manga publications over the next 200 years, focusing on highly sexual and sometimes taboo subjects, indicative of a perplexing Japanese permissiveness when it comes to sexual themes. And that answers your burning question about why octopi are such a big part of Japanese porn. World War II represented a significant shift for manga. Thousands of foreign GIs were stationed in Japan as part of the rebuilding process. Not only did they bring Western sensibilities to the islands, they also brought comic books. This new influx of creative references facilitated the evolution of the existing manga form, and also led to a pointed distinction in the content of manga pre- and post-war. Stories were originally quite cerebral, pensive, and philosophical. After World War II, there emerged a decidedly violent element to them, and this is quite an understandable outcome, as it was born from the fears of war and the uncertainty of a future in a society that had been utterly devastated. Those violent stories eventually inspired and were inspired by the samurai film genre. This led to titles such as Lone Wolf and Cub, and overall that manga plus samurai formula led to the anime that we grew up with. Anime is the very archetypal form of Japanese animation and included titles such as Gatchaman, known in the US and Canada as Battle of the Planets, Space Battleship Yamato, also known as Star Blazers, Space Pirate Captain Harlock, which I fucking love, and ultimately the anime masterpiece Akira in 1988. Akira was manga plus samurai plus yakuza plus technology, and if you haven't seen it, you have to. It really gives you a feel for what the samurai genre can bring to unrelated material. These initial forays of borrowing and adaptation would eventually see the creation of animated titles both Japanese and non-Japanese such as Samurai Jack, Ghost in the Shell, Cowboy Bebop, and the like. A very interesting aside, if you've ever wondered why Japanese anime features characters with huge eyes, it's because of the influence of Betty Boop. No kidding. Her exploits were very popular in Japan from her debut and served as a template for artists to render ubiquitously, a perfect example of an archetypal construct. And getting back to the idea of the archetypes in samurai films, there is also the concept of the quest. Now, the idea of the quest itself is not something that I will ascribe to the samurai genre. The idea of a person or a group working to achieve an important goal or find an important person or item is as old as time itself. An example of this is Chrétien de Troyes' Perceval from around 1180 AD, which centers on the search for the Holy Grail, a quest also mentioned in Sir Thomas Malory's Le Mort d'Arthur from 1485. When we talk about samurai films, it is the fusion of the quest with the nobility and purpose of the samurai that makes for compelling tales. Kenji Mizoguchi's 47 Ronin had a compelling and familiar central quest focused on revenge, and his equally amazing Ugetsu from 1953 transforms the quest idea significantly. This movie is interesting because it isn't what you think it is. The pursuit of obsession here crafts a tale that is quite unlike other samurai films in that this particular movie is only tangentially associated with the samurai, but they are central to the plot nonetheless. Martin Scorsese was involved with the restoration of this film, and I suggest that you watch it. You will see that it has lent inspiration to other films outside of the samurai genre. We had mentioned the Klingons as a mirror of the samurai, and I wanted to point out that we also see the concept of warriors on a quest in the Deep Space Nine episode Blood Oath, where Kor, Koloth, and Kang, who made their first appearances in the original series episodes Errand of Mercy, The Trouble with Tribbles, and Day of the Dove, reunited to avenge the deaths of their firstborn sons.
Those are Klingons?
Mr. Worf? They are Klingons, and it is a long story.
I believe that the most important archetype of all is the concept of the Ronin. The Ronin is, in many ways, the alter ego of the samurai. Ronin are essentially samurai that are out of a job, whether because they lost a key battle, or their lord was killed, or they somehow were dishonored. The Ronin have been cast away, their skills no longer needed, and, since their skills and their purpose were one and the same, they end up being broken spirits who wander aimlessly to either live a life of misery, or to act as mercenaries for hire. As I describe this, how many other movies with the same basic concept just popped into your head? We see it clearly in the spy thriller genre, such as stories from Robert Ludlum in the form of Jason Bourne, and also from the James Bond franchise. When you think of Alec Trevelyan in 1995's GoldenEye or Raul Silva in 2012's Skyfall, we can see how dangerous masterless Ronin can become. We see it in 1999's Ghost Dog, The Way of the Samurai, which is an excellent mash of samurai and gangster films from Jim Jarmusch, who also directed the exceptional films Night on Earth from 1991 and Down by Law from 1986. We even see it within Japanese cinema itself in the gloriously bloody and over-the-top Street Fighter series from 1974, starring Sonny Chiba as the title character, a mercenary for hire in modern times, singular of purpose and completely amoral. And I would say that an excellent example of the adapted Ronin concept is John Frankenheimer's incredible 1998 film Ronin, starring Robert De Niro, Jean Reno, Natasha McElhone, and a great star-studded cast. This film hits the many familiar samurai beats that we have been discussing. It's a tale of disgraced former operatives who are now mercenaries for hire, made even more mysterious because it's never clear how each got to where they are in the film.
You've done this kind of thing before? No. How difficult can it be?
There are call-outs to honor and the following of a code.
How did you know it was an ambush?
Whenever there is any doubt, there is no doubt. That's the first thing they teach you.
Who taught you?
I don't remember. That's the second thing they teach you.
We have the quest to locate the mysterious silver briefcase.
What's in the case? What's in the case? What's in the case?
I thought what you wanted was the kiss.
Oh, we'll get the case.
Huh? We'll get the case, eh, Gregor? Don't you worry about the case.
We have the typical plot intrigues, in this case the idea of the double, triple, quadruple, and yes, if you can believe it, the quintuple cross. We see a connection to organized crime. We see allusions to a caste system.
So what brought you here?
A fellow that doesn't work so well.
The man in the wheelchair.
We have the requisite battles and blood. And we have the greatest car chase ever captured on film. Okay, so that last bit is not about samurai films, but it does represent the set-piece concept that we see in many exciting samurai movies, whether it be the final battle of armies or the siege of a castle. And yes, Ronin is the gold standard for all cinematic car chases, so we'll just leave it at that. It's mind-boggling to think about how much influence the samurai films have truly had, absolutely everywhere. I think of movies like 1998's Blade, with the samurai-influenced vampire hunter played by Wesley Snipes, and that makes me think of 1982's Blade Runner and the interesting ethos seemingly shared by Deckard, Roy Batty, and even Gaff. And when I think of Blade Runner, that makes me think of Ridley Scott, who also directed the 1989 film Black Rain, which in so many ways modernizes the concept of samurai and Bushido through the specific lens of organized crime. Another great example is that 1972's Lone Wolf and Cub, Baby Cart at the River Styx had a direct influence on John Carpenter's 1986 cult classic Big Trouble in Little China, where these three beheaded assassins were the inspiration for the three storms in Carpenter's film, and which even inspired a digital version when the Lightning Storm character inspired the playable character Raiden in the Mortal Kombat video game series from 1992. If we think of subgenres to samurai films, then ninja films tap into the same mythology of which they are a part. Ninja were the hired goons of the samurai mythos.
Hired goons!
Hired goons?
They were contract killers, skilled in their art, but who were widely viewed as being devoid of the honor enjoyed by the samurai, as they did not meet their opponents head-on. Instead, they would disguise themselves and hide, and preferred methods such as poisoning drinks and using throwing stars and blow darts. The 1970s and 80s saw a huge uptick in the popularity of ninja flicks, really taking off with fare such as 1981's Enter the Ninja and 1980's The Octagon, and reaching a peak with Nine Deaths of the Ninja, Revenge of the Ninja, Pray for Death, and other vehicles starring Sho Kosugi, who was the Robert De Niro of ninja films. This uptick fizzled out almost as spectacularly since many of these films, in particular Enter the Ninja, became almost self-parody in the vein of most productions from producers such as Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus in the 1980s. American Ninja, anyone? Or Gymkata? Yikes. What the ninja films were really about was the need to secure inclusion into an existing grand mythology, and this is what explains the strong thread between samurai films and their tiebacks in westerns, ninja films, and other film genres. As we've seen, the nobility and purity of the warrior code is frankly intoxicating, and the samurai film has shown very clearly that this can be a deep and nuanced element of many disparate yet equally engaging narratives. When done properly, that is. Quentin Tarantino is a Western director that can do it properly. Let me say it straight. Tarantino gets it. He knows exactly why people love different film genres, and he is able to narratively and visually articulate that knowledge in a way that connects directly with his audience. In short, he knows what makes westerns cool, what makes kung fu films cool, what makes gangster films cool, and of course, what makes samurai films cool. In 2003's Kill Bill, Tarantino weaves a tale that incorporates all of these genres and many of their respective archetypes, themes, and tropes. If you stop to think of it, look at what you've got. Obviously, there's a tie-in to the samurai genre through swords and fighting styles. You even have Sonny Chiba cast as a master sword maker. You have a battle with Lucy Liu's character Oren Ishii that is heavily based on the 1973 film Lady Snowblood. You have blood spurts that recall Sanjuro and other such stylized violence in samurai films. But then you also have Yakuza-type gangsters in the form of the Crazy 88, and you have Chiaki Kuriyama playing a homicidal character who recalls the feeling of the Last Person Standing film Battle Royale from 2000, in which she also appeared. You have the character of Pai Mei, who is clearly a Chinese martial arts master, and the camera work and rapid zoom-in shots recalls the Chopsaki era almost exactly, as does the 5-point palm exploding heart technique finishing move. And you also have Uma Thurman dressed in the same jumpsuit that Bruce Lee wore in Game of Death, which was filmed in 1972 but released in 1978. It is astounding how Tarantino manages to mash together these various elements. You'd think it would be an unimaginable mess, and in the hands of a lesser director, it would have been. But Tarantino makes it work, because again, He understands what makes all of these types of films so awesome. He even drew upon comic book and anime influences, not only in the animated backstory of Lucy Liu's character, but also in the amazing monologue that Bill gives at the end of Volume 2, where he talks about comic book mythology and the true nature of Superman. Amazing stuff. Tarantino teaches us something very clearly in all of his films. If you understand the subject matter, and more importantly the nature of the subject matter's appeal, you can blend, mold, extrude, and form a brilliant and cohesive narrative that will present something new and fresh. Inspiration and adaptation do not work in just one direction. This is clear from Kurosawa's adaptations of Shakespearean works, as well as other works of respected literature for many of his films. Such was the case with Throne of Blood from 1957, which is an excellent adaptation of Macbeth. Another example is the film Ran from 1985, which is his adaptation of King Lear. Ran is the Japanese word for chaos, and I believe that Ran is the greatest samurai film ever made. It's interesting that this would be the case for a Japanese film that was adapted from a European story written almost 400 years before. It doesn't really stop there, though, because tracing the Shakespearean thread back even further, the bard himself adapted stories of intrigue, deceit, love, and chaos, illustrative of the human condition, from influences as far back as the Greek and Roman eras. Kurosawa also drew upon other literary inspirations, such as Ambrose Bierce in the case of the 1950 Jidaigeki film Rashomon, which was based on Bierce's The Moonlit Road, written in 1907. This is the classic story of a crime being investigated from the perspectives of several witnesses. We've seen this idea adapted numerous times, including the Star Trek The Next Generation episode A Matter of Perspective, and it always manages to be a crowd pleaser. A book version even meanders its way through Ghost Dog: The Way of the Samurai. These interconnections always fascinate me. We see the same adapting of ideas in Tarantino's works as well. If you thought Reservoir Dogs was particularly fresh and unique, well, watch Ringo Lam's City on Fire from 1987. Same story. If you thought that Jules and Vincent were a unique combination in 1994's Pulp Fiction, then have a look at the hitmen in 1972's The Italian Connection with Henry Silva and Woody Strode. Look familiar? Even Martin Scorsese's 2006 film The Departed was adapted from the Chinese film Infernal Affairs from 2002. Adaptations of these universal elements we've discussed can be seen in comic books as well. Marvel's character Elektra is solidly based on these ideals. Wolverine is another prime example of this, as one of Logan's most famous character arcs is his time spent in Japan, as chronicled in Wolverine Volume 1, published in 1982. Logan is influenced by Eastern culture, coming to realize that he has much in common with the samurai, ultimately falling in love with a Japanese woman, ending in tragedy. This story was adapted into the James Mangold film The Wolverine in 2013, in which Logan also battled a version of the Silver Samurai, cementing these influences into the narrative. Other comic characters also borrow from these samurai sensibilities, such as the Punisher, Captain America, and as we mentioned earlier, Batman. To be honest, these influences are often transformed to become an affirmation of the American ethos rather than a direct link to samurai films. However, I choose to view this as an acknowledgement of universal values that transcends cultures. That's certainly a key driver behind the huge popularity of the miniseries Shogun, which became such a phenomenon when it aired in 1980. And these values, as perceived by a culture, can definitely be powerful and sometimes tragic. There was a revival of the Bushido Code of sorts, and it took hold in imperialist Japan leading up to World War II. We've all heard the idea of Japanese soldiers committing seppuku or harakiri, ritual suicide by disembowelment, when they lost a battle rather than be shamed. This type of extreme fealty culminated in the Divine Wind, or kamikaze pilots of World War II, who gladly gave up their lives in service of the emperor, just as traditional samurai would fight for their lords. The analogy isn't perfect, really, since the samurai were well paid for their loyalty. However, it was that ethos we've examined that led Japanese soldiers, and in some cases civilians as well, to unquestionably fight for the honor of Japan. The realization of this resolve could credibly have played a part in the dropping of the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima and days later on Nagasaki, the perception of the time being that the Japanese, honor-bound in a rich tradition of servitude and sacrifice, were more likely to fight to the last child than to surrender. One thing that is sure, the nature of the samurai film changed after World War II, becoming much more inherently dark and violent, and it isn't the only example of a narrative pivot in Japanese films. Another cinematic genre that the Japanese gave us is referred to as the kaiju film. For those who have never seen a Godzilla movie, kaiju means monster, and 1954's Godzilla is the very first of the kaiju films. These films were a direct expression of the Japanese trauma from the dropping of the atomic bombs. Monsters that were awakened by atomic blasts, monsters that breathed atomic breath and flew with atomic jets. It was a very fast and effective genesis of a brand new narrative that also quickly evolved to see many of these monsters become protectors of Japan, and the kaiju films, like the samurai films, also inspired many other movies for decades to come. If you've seen 2013's Pacific Rim, you've seen the modern descendant of the kaiju genre that started with Godzilla. Strong narratives, compelling characters, that leads to inspiration. It's clear by now that westerns and samurai films are tightly intertwined. In the 1971 film Red Sun, directed by Terrence Young, we see the actual collision of the two genres through the film's iconic leads, Charles Bronson and Toshiro Mifune. What always intrigues me about this excellent film is not only how seamlessly it blends, showcases, compares, and contrasts the similarities and differences between the Western and the samurai films, but also that it essentially defies the fish-out-of-water concept that the movie initially appears to be pushing. We expect to see a character who has trouble adapting to new and unfamiliar surroundings. We've seen this idea numerous times. One example is the 1988 film Red Heat, another is the Back to the Future series, but here our expectations are subverted. We think Toshiro Mifune's character is the one who's out of his depth. In reality, he's just fine, focused on his quest. It's everyone else around him that is surprised by this samurai in the Wild West. This is an awesome movie, and if you haven't seen it, put it on your list. When we speak of the influences of samurai films on cinema as a whole, it isn't just about one particular element. Rather, it's how all of these elements weave together to make the samurai film what it is. Coupled with the artistry of the filmmakers involved, we are treated to so many standout, memorable, and utterly amazing works. And you may say, well, that's not really a samurai thing, it's just a human thing, and you'd be correct. That is precisely the point when discussing the popularity and universality of the elements of samurai films. As we have been demonstrating, emotional impact need not be constrained by a single genre or narrative. However, it's also important to recognize not only the pedigree of these noble sensibilities, but also the common and interconnected evolution that has allowed these sensibilities to continue to speak to us decade after decade. It is not a Japanese thing, or an American thing, or a Chinese thing. It's an interwoven tapestry of masters telling their stories, nurturing them and refining them, building the mythology for harvesting by the generations to come. In this way, we see a prime example of how cinema, the telling of stories, is truly a communal structure that brings us all together across borders, languages, and epochs. The next time you sit down to watch a film such as has been described here today, reflect on that evolution, and be respectfully inspired. Some may take exception to the samurai history being characterized as a mythology, and to that I offer the reality that whenever we pay homage or celebrate the past, we have a natural tendency to focus on the best aspects of a thing while in some cases downplaying or eliminating the negative aspects. I suppose it's a function of the desire of humans to look back upon our collective history and be able to demonstrate that there was more good about us than bad. In that sense, history is transformed to an extent, and the final product is not dissimilar to the original, but is also not an exact representation either. We create an idealized version of the narrative, and we accept it. As we've seen, this acceptance is rooted in our wanting to possess the desirable qualities we see, the desire to be a death machine bound by a noble code, I guess. It is interesting to see how westerns in North American cinema saw a significant shift beginning in the early 70s, wherein things became a lot grittier. We saw that in films such as 1973's High Plains Drifter, 1980's The Long Riders, 1993's Tombstone, and even 1985's Silverado, the most traditional American Western of the post-1970 era. It was a decision to start embracing the real over the stylized, which reached its ultimate expression with Unforgiven. Unforgiven is a brilliant film because it directly deconstructs the mythology of the spaghetti westerns, but it needed that Superman mythology of the spaghetti westerns to work at all. The same happened with war films, enhancing their impact through a sharp increase in graphic violence so as not to romanticize the horrors of war. It began with Patton in 1970 and reached a startling apex with Saving Private Ryan in 1998. These transformations have now become the new version of the respective mythology. Mythologies are, in the end, essentially our desired collective memory about who we are, and as with all memories, they inevitably, eventually fade. On a warm July day in 1853, the sun rose over a Japan that had seen centuries of a well-defined class system, that had upheld deep-rooted traditions, and which had paid reverential tribute to its warrior class. On that day, 4 American warships entered Tokyo Harbor, demanding that Japan begin trading with the West. As citizen, emperor, and samurai alike gazed upon the war machines, far more powerful than anything Japan had ever created, outgunned, outmatched, and with little choice but to comply, everyone realized that Japan would never be the same. Leaders would soon begin an unprecedented modernization of the country that would be beneficial in many ways, but would also put Japan on the road to ruin as they played a desperate game of catch-up. It was on that day, too, that the samurai may have realized they were no longer relevant in the social fabric of their land. Within 40 years, their role in Japanese society would be only a memory. And it is in service of the preservation of that memory that samurai films, and all the narratives that they have inspired, continue to endure.